We are calling it shelter in place. And that sounds almost pastoral. But let's be honest, it's exile. We've been captured and quarantined, held captive by an invisible assailant. We may as well be wearing those ankle bracelets they put on prisoners to keep track of them. Home, grocery store, doctor's office, pharmacy, home, grocery store, liquor store, home, grocery store, social distancing visit to family, home. We aren't wearing bold zebra stripes or orange jumpsuits. We're in pajamas and sweats, slippers and flip-flops. We aren't going anywhere or doing anything, not the normal activities before captivity, theaters, restaurants, beaches and parks, concerts and plays, parties, baseball games, libraries and museums, travel to other states, out of the country for the pleasures of cultures not our own, breathtakingly beautiful natural vistas, towns and cathedrals older than anything we've built in this country by centuries. Turns out in a pandemic, everyone is without. The most benign line in Claudia Rankine's poem, Weather. We are doing without. We are absent even from worship. In the building, our pew is gathering dust, organ untuned, silenced. Who knew we could miss Sunday morning in the nave so much? I get emails from some of you with just that line. I miss being in the church, in the building, together with others. We are in worship on the phone, in the computer. Best seat at the YouTube cinema is on the couch in the living room or at the kitchen table or the bedroom with a cup of coffee, toast and fruit on the side. We're having communion with tea and toast, Oreos and milk, coffee and donuts, bread and wine. You're not seeing the chancel behind me, just the spot I picked for this week's sermon, this week's recording. We're not hearing the organ and choir in full. It's an extraordinary experience of deprivation for people who are used to freedom of movement, an array of choices, days filled with options and opportunities. It is relative, though, isn't it? We aren't among those who have lost their lives in this pandemic. Writing this on Monday, the number dead in the U.S. is 132,000. Hearing this Sunday morning, that number is probably very near or over 140,000 people. I talked to a member last week who is a hospice nurse and spends every day at risk going in and out of homes in which dying well is the work of the living. And confined to home, to narrow and constricted activities, our lives shrink, and we make the best of it and wonder how long it will last, and adjust and readjust to conditions that are on some days simply boring and now and then intolerable. And we're only just beginning. 4 months, and the myth of reopening is evaporating before our eyes as new cases, daily totals, break records daily. Hotspots is a roving title, a dubious crown for a day or a week, only to be snatched away by some city in another county or some state on the other side of the country. California and Arizona yesterday, Florida and Texas today. We're addicted to TV, to news, on the television, online, on paper, downloaded, shared on Facebook and Twitter, by podcast. And most of it is not good. Our president, 63 million people voted for him, is deliberately stoking racial tensions as a re-election campaign strategy. NASCAR and the state of Mississippi are removing the Confederate flag from their flags, and yet our president is talking about preserving our heritage, speaking only to his base of whites who cheer his every tweet and excuse his divisive and hateful words, immune to their venom. Fox News host Tucker Carlson called Senator Tammy Duckworth, decorated veteran helicopter pilot who lost both legs fighting in the Iraq War, called her a vandal who hated the United States. Her sin was suggesting it is worth discussing the removal of a statue of even George Washington, president, first president, and slaveholder. The president retreated Carlson's attack. Trump, not Washington. One is a former president. The other, not yet. But the news isn't all bad. The Dixie Chicks permanently retired the Dixie. Avery Bradley isn't joining his heavily favored for the championship Los Angeles Lakers at Disney World for the soon-to-resume NBA season because he has a 6-year-old son with compromising health issues. He said the decision wasn't a hard one to make at all. Lucian Truscott IV, a 6th-generation great-grandson of a slave owner, his description of himself, wrote this in an article in the New York Times last week. And it's time to honor one of our founding mothers, a woman who fought as an escaped slave to free those still enslaved, who fought as an armed scout for the Union Army against the Confederacy, a woman who helped to bring into being a more perfect union after slavery, a process that continues to this day. In Jefferson's place, there should be another statue. It should be of Harriet Tubman, he wrote. To see a 19-foot-tall bronze statue of a black woman who was a slave and also a patriot, in place of a white man who enslaved hundreds of men and women, is not erasing history, he wrote. It's telling the real history of America. Did I mention that the slaveholder Lucian Truscott IV, the slaveholder that Lucian is descendant from, is Thomas Jefferson? And more good news. In response to the intimate and powerful article by Caroline Randall Williams, My Body is a Confederate Monument, Jane from Seattle wrote this. As a white person, I do apologize for the sins of my ancestors. I remind myself that racism is not interrupted or dismantled by my guilt, by my niceness, or my smiling. I do take responsibility for repairing, continuing my process of listening, learning, and seeing this world from the perspective of my black neighbors. I also take responsibility for helping my white friends to wake up, leaning into education and away from policing. And most of all, for exercising my citizenship and demanding policy changes from my elected officials. Policies will dismantle the system that is racism. Shalom and justice are my prayers. I am here not to be right. I am here to learn is my new mantra. God is in this. Black people, people of color, indigenous people, women, immigrants, refugees, gays and lesbians, transgendered people, people with differing abilities, mixed race veterans, elders among us cast aside for the sin of celebrating too many birthdays past some arbitrary prime. We've all been there, speaking truth to deaf power, crossing bridges to nowhere, crossing again, burying sons and daughters, hear me? But this is new. Make good on your word, Jane. Lucian, yours are the missing parts that need new players, the ones to help make good on the lofty language not yet fully realized. Not nearly. Exile. Babylon has fallen. Cyrus, the king of Persia, rules over exiled Israelites. Exile. Worse than the silence in the nave at Riverside. The temple is destroyed. And deep in this despair, this subjugation of centuries, Isaiah, this is the prophet we think of as second Isaiah, sees a vision, writes a vision that is a song of home for the exiled, a confidence in the creator of earth and its nourishing abundance, a deep trusting in the Hesed, the steadfast and unfailing love of God. This prophet saw Cyrus as an instrument of God. It would be wrong to interpret that to mean that captivity was the will of God, just as we need not think that slavery was a tool chosen or permitted by God to bring us to this redeeming moment. Who needs a God like that insecure, that callous, that negligent?